We don't have the first copy made of Mark, or any of the first copies, or copies of the copies, and we don't have copies of the copies of the copies of Mark. Mark's book was copied for very many years before we have any copy. Things start changing when you start getting earlier. The manuscripts in the 3rd century aren't nearly as good as the manuscripts in the 4th century. The scribes don't appear to be trained. When you get to the 2nd century, many of the manuscripts, we don't have much, we just have fragments here and there from the 2nd century, but they're not nearly as good as those 4th century manuscripts. Who was copying the manuscripts to begin with? To the shock and dismay of many of his readers, John Mill's Greek New Testament contained 30,000 places of variation among the manuscripts that he had examined. 30,000 places where the manuscripts differed from one another. This really upset some people. There were people who claimed that John Mill was trying to render the text of the New Testament uncertain. His supporters pointed out he didn't invent these 30,000 places, he just noted that they exist. There have been innumerable stages between the original and our first copy. How many mistakes had crept into the text before we start getting copies? There's no way to know, because we don't have earlier copies. These are the earliest. The first complete copy, 300 years after. How many intervening stages of copying was it? We simply don't know. We can't know because we don't have the manuscripts to tell us. This again is not simply true for the Gospel of Mark, it's true for all of the books of the New Testament. It seems like when you buy the New Testament that we know what's in it, because you go to the bookstore and you buy a New Testament, and you go to another bookstore, you buy the New Testament. It's the same thing, but not in the ancient world. If you lived in Rome and you read a copy of Mark and then you went to Ephesus and read a copy of Mark, you might be reading 2 different copies with 2 different wordings of this passage or that passage. These copies are circulating throughout the Roman world. Wherever Christians were, they wanted copies of the Gospels. If you wanted a copy of the Gospel and you lived in Ephesus, but it was made in Rome, you had to make a copy in Rome and take it to Ephesus. And then you made a copy that was maybe a copy of the copy of the copy. So maybe you're making a copy of a copy that in fact had a lot of mistakes in it, but that's the copy you have now in Ephesus. That's the problem we're confronted with the text of the New Testament.